Shah is a remarkable one. Not only was he a Sufi mystic who was widely and deeply respected, but he lived at a very pivotal time in history where he witnessed the reign of Shah Jehan, who commissioned and oversaw the building of the exquisite Taj Mahal, and that of his notorious younger son, Aurangzeb, who would eventually kill his brothers and imprison his own father in order to secure his place as the sole emperor of the Mughal dynasty. Yet, despite these political turmoils, Mullah Shah taught a spiritual path that transcended sectarian borders. He attracted the devotion of two of Shah Jahan's favorite children, Dara Shikoh and Fatima Jahanara. Both were exceptionally devoted to the wise sage, and Mullah Shah's life appears to have been spared, due to the intercession of both Dara Shikoh and his sister Jahanara, who would eventually write a Persian biography of her spiritual teacher. It is of interest to note that Mullah Shah advocated the meditative practice of Nod or Shabad yoga, which he called Sultan-ul-Azkar, the loftiest of spiritual disciplines. Mullah Shah was born AD 1584, in the village of Urksa in Badakhshan, a mountainous and inaccessible country to the north of the Indian Caucasus. His family, which was of Mongol origin, held a certain position, and his grandfather had been judge of the village. At the age of 21, the young man quitted his relatives and his country, and went back to Balkh, then a center of learning in Central Asia. He made great progress there, especially in the knowledge of Arabic. After some time he left Balkh, and turning his steps southward, arrived at Kashmir, where he continued his studies, but an irresistible thirst after truth made him feel the necessity of seeking a spiritual guide, and he resolved to go to Lahore, where there lived a celebrated saint, Sheikh Mian Mir. The reception he met with was not favorable. Mian Mir at first repulsed him, but allowed himself at last to be overcome by the perseverance of the young man, and taught him Sufi exercises according to the rule of the Qadiri order of dervishes. The stifling heat of Lahore did not suit the health of Mullah Shah, who accordingly resolved to spend the summers in Kashmir, returning to Lahore for the winter. He led this life for several years, till he had passed through all the stages of asceticism, but his spiritual guide would not lead him to the supreme goal of mystical science, which is termed union with God, or knowledge of oneself. Mian Mir only spoke to him of it in an enigmatic way and said, "Do not cease to study thyself and thine own heart, for thy goal is in thyself." In the year 1636 AD, he returned again, as usual, from Lahore to Kashmir, and practiced his austerities without relaxation. When one day, by the special favor of the divinity, and without the assistance of any spiritual preceptor, the desired image revealed itself to him. By this expression is understood, in mystic phraseology, union with God, and the conception of absolute being, which is equivalent to the knowledge of oneself. When Mullah Shah thus attained the goal of his mystical aspirations, he was in his 47th year, and had been engaged 27 years in the spiritual exercises of the Sufis. When he returned to Lahore, he informed his spiritual guide that he had attained union with God. The latter advised him not to divulge the fact, and not to give up his ascetic practices. In Kashmir, Mullah Shah had collected round him a little circle of devoted disciples. The strong emotional condition into which Mullah Shah's new spiritual experience had brought him did not prevent him from doing his best not to offend against the religious law, and he was in the habit of saying to his friends, "Whoso does not respect the precepts of the religious law is not one of us." Mullah Shah had always been of a retiring disposition, but in his present mood he carried his self-isolation so far that he closed the door of his house and only received his intimates at fixed times. When he dropped his habitual reserve, the spiritual power of Mullah Shah had become so great that every novice whom he caused to sit in front of him and to concentrate his mental faculties on his own heart, became clairvoyant to such a degree that his internal senses were unfolded, and the unseen world appeared to him. Mullah Shah expressed himself in very bold terms regarding the manner with which he conceived God and his relation to humanity. In one of his poems he says, "The sage who knows himself has become God, be sure of that, my friend." In another poem, which caused a temporary estrangement between himself and the Sheikh Mayan Mir, he said, "My heart by 1,000 tongues cries to me, I am God. What reproach of heresy can they bring against me that this utterance comes to my lips?" Those who had attained union with God used to say, "I am absolute being. But I only say what I have heard from the mouth of Sheikh Mayan Mir." In the meantime, the number of his adherents daily increased. Persons of all classes in society became his adherents, even women became capable of mystical intuitions by the effect of his prayers and without having seen him. However, the increasing number of those who wished to approach him commenced to be inconvenient, and he said, "I am not a sheikh of dervishes who receives novices and builds convents. Neither the mosque nor the dervish convent attract me, but the purity of the desert and the freedom of the open country." In the year 1634 AD, a certain Mir Baki, a descendant of the Prophet, attached himself to Mullah Shah, and experienced in a short time ecstatic states. He then preached the doctrine of union with God without any reserve. At the same time he claimed to be free from the precepts of the religious law. The following lines were composed by him. "Why should my hand let go this sparkling cup of my soul? I already realize the aspirations of tomorrow. Which lines, rendered into prose, seem to mean, "Why should I pass my life sadly on in self-maceration and austerity? I prefer to anticipate now the delights which they speak of as belonging to the future life." This is Epicureanism, pure and simple, such as we find it in the Odes of Hafiz and the quatrains of Omar Khayyam. When Mullah Shah heard of these extravagant utterances, he caused Mir Baki to be expelled from the town. At the same time, the doctrines of Mullah Shah regarding union with God began to make a great deal of sensation, and a large number of influential men who belonged to the Conservative Party raised against him the accusation of heresy without really understanding his teaching. They quoted some of his verses against him, and said, "Mullah Shah is beginning to imitate Manza Helaj. He should be brought to trial and sentenced to death." They unanimously drew up an indictment against him and affixed their seals. A large number of religious functionaries joined them, and they submitted their petition to the Emperor Shah Jehan, requesting him to pronounce sentence of death against Mullah Shah. The emperor consented, and dispatched a firman to that effect to Zafar Khan, governor of Kashmir. Shah Jahan's son, the Prince Dara Shikoh, had been absent, and only learned what had happened when he returned. He immediately went to his father and represented to him that Mullah Shah was a pupil of Sheikh Mayan Mir, a man renowned for piety, and that the emperor ought, before pronouncing final judgment, to ask the latter regarding the conduct of his former disciple. The prince concluded by saying that in such a matter haste was ill-omened, because to deprive a man of life is to pull down a building of which God is the architect. The emperor accepted this appeal graciously, and ordered the execution to be deferred. Meanwhile, the news of the condemnation of Mullah Shah had spread and reached Kashmir, but the respite obtained by the prince was still unknown there. The friends of Mullah Shah were in despair, and used their utmost endeavors to persuade him to fly. But he answered, "I am not an impostor that I should seek safety in flight. I am an utterer of truth. Death and life are to me alike. Let my blood in another life also redden the impaling stake. I am living and eternal, death recoils from me, for my knowledge has vanquished death. The sphere where all colors are effaced has become my abode. Once," he added, "I used to bar the door of my house with a bolt in order not to be disturbed by anyone, but now I will leave it wide open, in order that whoever wishes to make me a martyr may enter at his pleasure." Mian Mir told him that Mullah Shah was apt to be carried out of himself when in an ecstatic state, and that then he sometimes spoke without observing the reserve necessary on the doctrine of union with God, but he adjured the emperor at the same time to take no steps against his old pupil, for, he said, "This holy man is a consuming fire, and woe to you if he be irritated, for he could destroy the world. In any case prevent the orthodox party from persecuting him, otherwise some dreadful disaster may happen." This advice made a deep impression on the emperor, who thanked Prince Dara Shikoh for having prevented his carrying out the sentence of death. He said, "These theologians have tried to persuade me to kill a visionary dervish. I thank thee, my son, for having prevented my committing an act of injustice." Some time afterwards the emperor went to Kashmir, but he did not see Mullah Shah, who had become so fond of solitude that he rarely showed himself in the city. In 1635 AD, the Sheikh Mian Mir died at Lahore, and in the same year one of the chief nobles of the court named Najat Khan became a disciple of Mullah Shah. About the same time, Mozaffar Beg, one of the emperor's suite, devoted himself to his service, and his example was followed by several of his friends. But no sooner had they been initiated into the mystical doctrines than they believed themselves privileged to dispense with the prescribed fast of Ramazan and the obligatory prayers. Considering that the religious law no longer applied to them. Being informed of these irregularities, Mullah Shah prayed the governor to have them removed from the town. About this time he made a collection of his verses, among which are the following: "If alchemy can change dust into gold, thou marvelest, but asceticism is an alchemy which changes dust into God. If a man dives into the ocean of deity, what does he become? As a drop which falls from the clouds into the sea." Regarding pedantic theologians, he says, "Well, I know these preachers who do not practice, their memory stored with 100,000 traditions, while their mind is empty of ideas." In 1639 the Emperor Shah Jehan came a second time to Kashmir, and took up his dwelling in the park called Zafar Abad, in a pavilion which commanded a delightful view of the lake. No sooner had he arrived than he sent for Mullah Shah, who came without delay. The emperor received him with marked kindness and conversed long with him on subjects relating to the Sufi sciences. This same year is remarkable for an event which had important results for Mullah Shah and his followers. The Prince Dara Shikoh, who had saved Mullah Shah's life by his intervention, had always been marked by keen religious feeling, and often spent whole nights in prayer and meditation. He had often heard of the extraordinary powers of Mullah Shah, but had never had the opportunity of seeing him, as the sheikh still maintained his habits of retirement. Little by little, a feeling of irresistible curiosity took possession of the prince. He determined to see the holy man who was so highly spoken of, and one night, accompanied by a single servant named Mujahid, he left his palace and directed his steps towards the dwelling of Mullah Shah. The latter had in his courtyard an ancient plane tree, and was in the habit of sitting at the foot of it during the night, lost in meditation. Having arrived at the house, the prince ordered his servant to wait near the door, and entered the courtyard alone. Seeing the sheikh seated at the foot of the tree, he stopped and remained standing till the master should speak to him. The latter knew very well who the newcomer was, and that little persuasion was needed to make him one of his disciples, but he made as though he did not see him. A long time passed thus, till the sheikh broke the silence by asking the prince, "Who art thou?" The prince did not speak. Mullah Shah then said again, "Why dost thou not answer? Speak, and tell thy name." The prince, filled with embarrassment, replied, "My name is Dara Shikoh." "Who is thy father?" "The Emperor Shah Jehan." "Why hast thou come to see me?" "Because I feel drawn towards God, and seek for a spiritual guide." On this Mullah Shah exclaimed sharply, "What are emperors and princes to me? Know that I am a man devoted to asceticism. Is this hour of the night the time to come and trouble me? Go, and do not show thyself here a second time." Deeply wounded by this reception, the prince withdrew and re-entered his palace, where he spent the whole night weeping. But in spite of all his disappointment, he felt himself drawn the next night by an irresistible attraction towards the saint's dwelling, but the latter this time did not even condescend to speak to him. Mujahid, the servant who accompanied the prince, became angry, and said to his master, "What miracles has this crabbed dervish shown you that you should come here every night and expose yourself to such indignities? Ordinary dervishes are cheerful folk, not uncivil and morose like this old man. For my own part, I set no great store by this asceticism, and the only thing that makes me uneasy is your putting faith in it." The prince answered, "If Mullah Shah was an impostor, so far from treating me as he has done, he would, on the contrary, have prayed God to bring me to him. It is precisely his independent spirit and irritated manner which proves him to be an extraordinary man." That same night when Mujahid returned home, he was seized by fever and carried off in a few hours. Dara Shikoh, when informed of this terrible event, was profoundly moved. He reproached himself bitterly for not having at once punished his servant's insolence, and considered the death of Mujahid as a divine punishment which menaced him also. He immediately sent for the Qazi Afzal, one of his most devoted friends, and told him of his anxiety. The latter was a friend of Akand Mullah Muhammad Sindh, a disciple of Mullah Shah, and at his instance the sheikh consented to see the prince. Dara Shikoh could not pay his visit during the day, from fear of arousing public curiosity, but as soon as night fell, he presented himself before the sheikh, whom this time he found seated in his cell. Before crossing the threshold, the prince saluted the holy man with profound respect, and the latter bade him enter and be seated. The cell was lighted by a single lamp, whose wick was smoking. In his eager desire to discern the venerable features of the sheikh, the prince dressed the wick with his own fingers. This simple action gained him the sheikh's affection. At the end of some days he bade him to blindfold himself, then he concentrated his attention upon him in such a way that the invisible world was revealed to the view of the prince, who felt his heart filled with joy. Dara Shikoh had a sister, the Princess Fatima, to whom he was deeply attached. As soon as he had become a disciple of Mullah Shah and his heart had been open to the intuition of the spiritual world, he hastened to inform his sister. This news made such an impression on the mind of the princess that she wrote to the sheikh several letters full of humility and devotion. He read them all, but made no reply for more than a month, till he was convinced that Fatima was animated by an invincible resolution. At last he accorded his sympathy to her also, and admitted her to the circle of the initiates. The princess persevered ardently in these mystical studies, and received the instructions of her spiritual guide by correspondence. She attained to such perfection that she arrived at intuitive knowledge of God and union with him. Although the sheikh was full of affection for all his disciples, he had a particular regard for her, and was in the habit of saying that she had attained to such an extraordinary degree of knowledge that she was fit to be his successor. Mullah Shah was now old and infirm. He had passed several winters at Lahore, surrounded by the care and attention of his friends and pupils. In the year 1655 AD, the emperor wrote to him to invite him to pass the winter with him at Shah Jehan, his ordinary residence, but the sheikh was beginning to suffer from weakness of the eyes, and did not feel strong enough to undertake the journey. For some years he remained in Kashmir, and would often say, "The theosophist ought to profit by length of life. My life is approaching its end, let us then enjoy our stay in Kashmir, and not leave it." In AD 1658 Aurangzeb, Dara Shikoh's younger brother, seized on the person of his father the Emperor Shah Jehan, whom he kept in confinement for the rest of his life, and had Dara assassinated in prison. Aurangzeb was a bigoted Mohammedan, and his accession to the throne threatened to have serious consequences for Mullah Shah. As soon as he had assumed the reins of government, the clerical party began to represent to him that Mullah Shah taught doctrines contrary to revealed religion. They were not wanting witnesses on the other side, but the emperor, on hearing the complaints against Mullah Shah, sent an order to the governor of Kashmir to send him to the capital. The governor pleaded for a delay on account of Mullah Shah's advanced age and weakness till he was strong enough to make the journey. A year thus passed by. Some verses which Mullah Shah composed in honor of Aurangzeb made a favorable impression on the emperor, and the Princess Fatima having interceded on behalf of her old teacher, Aurangzeb revoked his first order, and merely enjoined him to take up his residence at Lahore as soon as possible. It was not till 1660 AD that Mullah Shah could obey this order. He left Kashmir at the beginning of winter and came to Lahore, where he continued to live a retired life, only granting interviews to a few chosen disciples. But when from time to time he had an access of mystical emotion, he would speak of union with God without any reserve, in a loud voice, and without noticing who was present. One of his friends said to him one day, "We live in a strange time, and people are disquieted by your discourses on this matter. It would be more prudent to expound your doctrines with a little more reserve." The Sheikh answered him, "Up to the present I have never been afraid for my life. Books containing such doctrine are known to all, and everyone has read them. What precautions, then, at my time of life, ought I to observe? I cannot abandon or change my habits of thinking and speaking now." Some of his other sayings reported at this time show that he had already a presentiment of his approaching death. Kabul Khan, one of his friends, said to him one day, "Formerly our sovereign Aurangzeb loved to listen to discourses on the subject of mysticism, and I have often had the honor of reading before him passages from the Masnavi of Jalaluddin Rumi. The emperor was often so touched by them that he shed tears. Certainly when he comes to Lahore he will wish to see you." "No," replied Mullah Shah, "we shall never see him. The night is great with child, see what it will bring forth." In 1661 he had an attack of fever which lasted about 15 days. That year fever became epidemic at Lahore, and on the 11th of the month of Safar, Mullah Shah had another attack, which carried him off on the night of the 15th of the same month. He was buried in a plot of ground which he had already acquired for the purpose. The Princess Fatima bought the surrounding land, and erected a shrine of red stone over his tomb. The foregoing sketch of Mullah Shah gives a general view of Oriental spiritualism as it prevailed 2.5 centuries ago over a great part of Asia. The first point worthy of notice in it is the immense popularity of mystical ideas at that time, and the wide influence which they exercised over all minds. Round Mullah Shah gathered persons of every condition. Poor peasants as well as princes were seized with the same enthusiasm for his doctrines. The same ascetic training produced the same results in the most varying temperaments. The master seems to have exercised a kind of magnetic influence over his neophytes. He fixes his gaze upon them for a longer or shorter time, till their inward senses open and render them capable of seeing the wonders of the spiritual world. All the accounts are unanimous in this respect, and they carry such a stamp of sincerity that their veracity is indisputable. The biography of Mullah Shah also throws a great deal of light on the fundamental ideas of Oriental mysticism. They spring from a pantheistic philosophy in many respects, startlingly resembling those of modern times. Mullah Shah often insists that individual existence counts for nothing, and that nothing in reality exists outside of God, the absolute being. Every particular life dissolves in this universal unity. Life and death are mere changes in the form of existence.